I get it. The concept of a continent sinking sounds insane. It sounds insane even to the most alternative researcher types among us. Like, how the hell do you get rid of a continent? Right, so that's the question that we are going to ask ourselves today, and we are going to now employ real science and critical thinking methodology to see if we can't, I don't know, use a thought experiment type of environment to sink a continent. Now, I already did a show right before this to where I just went over the basics of, is this question even worth asking and thinking about? And I mean that from a realistic standpoint. I don't just want to do this thought experiment just as a fun exercise, although it is a fun exercise and it's something you should be doing anyway every single day of your life. But the reality is, this is a legitimate geological question. I mean, can you sink a continent? Right? Is it possible from a scientific perspective to throw a continent deep under the water and under the earth? You know what I mean. Basically, how do we get rid of a continent? How do we get rid of a large landmass that had, civilizations on it, people running around, slapping each other, having fun, and how do we send that to the bottom of the ocean and put tons of muck and garbage over it? And yes, right now I realize that Atlantis is coming into mind, and that is probably what we will end up using as our example in this thought experiment, but it is extremely important to understand that Atlantis is not the only continent that our ancestors claimed went below the waves. This cannot be stressed enough, and the reason why it can't be stressed enough is because, well, here, let's just start our thought experiment right now. Let's start with the basics. All right, let's have some fun. Let's start with presupposing that a continent can go under the ocean, can sink. All right, fine. So if a continent sinks, oh, and by the way, the criteria for sinking, I guess we should also establish this. How do we sink a continent overnight? Remember, this did not happen over weeks or years or millennia. All of our ancestors' stories are very specific in the details, which is completely ignored, interestingly enough, by tons of alternative researchers as well. This did not take 40 days and 40 nights to sink, right? So for all the people who believe Atlantis sank, but they're trying to blame the deluge for it, we don't have any reason to believe that. It doesn't fit in any chronological perspective in the first place. Second of all, it does not match what any of our ancestors talk about when they talk about these continents sinking beneath the waves. So one of the criteria that we have to fulfill in this thought experiment is that we have to sink this landmass in a night. It has to go down probably less than 24 hours if we're honest. It's got to go down quick. All right, so that's one of the main points that we have to prove. Now, going back to the multiple continent situation, if we are going to take this seriously and we are going to employ what our ancestors are talking about, right, and we're going to take what they said seriously, we are not going to just be like, oh yeah, those guys were all on drugs and they were monkeys and they were just making stuff up. No, we have no reason to believe that, so we will take the historicity seriously. And they all state that the continent went down overnight, or continents went down overnight. Now, the multiple continent part is important, because let's think about it. If we have one continent that goes down, right? Okay, fine, that's pretty crazy. But even if just one continent were to sink, the reality is that would cause an entire chain reaction across the entire globe. And there's a pretty good chance that if you only even had the one continent go down, the geological effects of that continent going down would absolutely tear apart, at the very least, the closest neighboring continents, right? And I don't just mean through the tsunami/water factor. That's going to be bad enough. If you have a continent go down that quick, remember, it has to go down overnight. Like, the reverberations are going to be massive, because this is not a slow process. It's a very quick, almost instantaneous process that our ancestors described. So if that happens, that kind of energy transfer across the globe, I mean, that would be insane. I mean, that amount of energy being displaced on this planet, I mean, the only place the energy has to go, right, is into the water and the strata of the earth. So any neighboring continent is also going to feel those effects. And the reality is there's a good chance that the neighboring continents are also going to suffer land mass loss. And on an extreme scale, by the way, I'm not talking like, oh yeah, a couple miles of beach is now gone or whatever. No, I'm talking about like entire chunks of those coastlines. Hundreds of miles like inland just absolutely wiped out, taken out by whatever the after effects are of a continent sinking. All right, so that's thing one, and that's something that we can prove using science, right? It's just basic physics, right? Energy transfer. When you have that kind of energy being released, it's going to go and it's going to affect everything around it. Now, it's important to make this distinction, or at least remember that we have to deal with the fallout of a continent sinking, because the ramifications are huge, right? We can't just have one continent sink and then everybody else is 100% remained untouched. It's not like if you were sitting on the shore of another continent and you were like watching with binoculars this other continent sinking, that you would be safe. I mean, if you are anywhere near a continent sinking, the reality is if you could see that, your ass is probably dead. And that's just going to be the reality. And this is exactly what we see our ancestors record. So if we are going to have that kind of fallout from a continent sinking, then our ancestors must have also reported the fallout. And we have that, right? We have our ancestors talking about unbelievable tidal waves sweeping across the continents once these events take place. We have mountains of water going around the planet. We have earthquakes that are absolutely just destroying everything around these cultures that survived, right? The survivors that come out of these continents going down, I mean, they're beaten up, right? And in a lot of cases, these people believe that they are the last people left on Earth because the destruction was so insane. I mean, we have no analog for it nowadays. I mean, a continent take the worst earthquake that we have recorded, more, recently, something that maybe we have video of, or a tsunami we have video of. These things, these events, which to us nowadays are insane. I mean, don't get me wrong, you go see some of these tsunami recordings, and it's just unbelievable to see that amount of water sweeping across a land. But if a continent goes down, those tsunamis that we see today on camera are nothing compared to what our ancestors would have seen necessarily, scientifically. They would have had to have dealt with a fallout that is just leagues ahead of anything we know today. And as I've already said, this is exactly what we find in these histories, right? This is why the funny thing is about what our ancestors talk about and what destructive events that they record. The interesting thing here is that we take all of those events as fiction, or at least the mainstream does, or people naturally do, because the things that our ancestors are describing, I mean, it's insane. It's nuts. I mean, all you have to do is say a continent sinking, and that's enough, right? But then these people go on ahead to explain and describe the fallout of what they have to deal with when these continents go down. Now, what's interesting is that not every single culture records the sinking of a continent, because the reality is a lot of cultures were not chilling ever by a coastline. It's important to remember that not everybody would have been aware of sinking continents, but they still describe the fallout from the events of said continent. Now, this is something I don't think a lot of people really think about, because the mainstream can always say, well, I mean, this culture doesn't record a continent going down. They just talk about massive floods and hurricanes. That's it, right? And it's like, okay, I get that, but the reality is, if a continent sank, or if there was an event taking place that sinks a continent, then yeah, of course these people are going to describe whatever they experienced, right? Just because they don't say, hey, this continent went down, doesn't mean that they were not around when it did. This is another thing to remember whenever we're studying catastrophism in across the planet, is that not everybody is going to have a good grasp on everything that went down. So even though these ancient cultures may not directly say, oh yeah, that continent sank and we know all about it, that does not mean that they did not live through the events that took the continent down. And in fact, this is really important. Because, like I said, not every culture is going to know everything, right? As far as we know, everybody did not understand the entire geography of planet Earth. Not everybody, as far as we know, was not walking around with full-scale maps of the planet and being able to say, oh yeah, I know a continent is there, and now it's not there anymore after yesterday. Why would they know this stuff? The only thing that cultures can ever describe is what they know and what they went through. So it's important to remember that not every culture is going to directly report on a continent sinking. So as we read all of these histories, we have to make sure that we understand that, hey, we can actually find correlations for the destruction of a continent in historic works that may not necessarily have anything to do with the sinking of a continent directly. And in fact, this is really important because the more cultures that can corroborate a frame of time to where they were having problems with natural disasters all over the place, right? That's a huge indication of the fallout of a sinking continent. And once again, that is exactly what we would scientifically expect to find. So now that we have established that we all around the planet, we have cultures recording either talking about land masses going underneath the water. And remember, it's not just continents that go under, it's islands that go under as well. Not as huge, but still important. I mean, when you lose an island where people live, I mean, that's still pretty crazy. Right? I get a continent is insane, but even an island sinking is still pretty crazy. Right? And people record islands sinking all over the place. And that's not weird. That's not a geological oddity either, right? That can happen. And so, of course, these people record only what they know. All right, I keep repeating myself. All right, next problem. So now, up until this point, we can at least trust that we are going to find some sort of parallel corroboration with respect to catastrophic events that would have taken place had a continent sunk. And when we go and we start looking across everybody's histories, we see that in spades. Now, this is also a problem. When we go and we look across all kinds of cultures' histories, one of the things that is unanimously found everywhere, obviously, is insane catastrophism, right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on. But just because an ancient culture is recording some pretty insane catastrophic events, that does not mean that it chronologically happened during the sinking of a continent, right? So what I mean by that is this. Our ancestors' histories are full of catastrophism, right? We've established that. There's no argument for that. We always have the gods being responsible for all of this stuff happening to Earth. All of these crazy catastrophic events that take place, right? The gods are always involved in it for some reason. But it doesn't just only happen once. It's not like everybody only has one story of one particular area in time to where catastrophes reign. Not even close. Right? We have at least 3 major catastrophic events that Earth went through that all of our ancestors record to one degree or another. So what we have to do is we have to be careful not to take certain pieces of a history and just because it has catastrophism in it doesn't mean that it is directly related to our topic in this case, a sinking of a continent. Like I said earlier in this video and in the other one before this, the reality is people will pick and choose what catastrophes they like from a history and what they don't like, and then they will apply it to their pet theory. Now, I keep using Atlantis as the example just because most people know Atlantis, but this pertains to like the other sinking continents as well. I'm not trying to forget them. But for example, alternative researchers, when they're trying to figure out Atlantis, they're just grasping at straws at a certain point. And the reason why they're grasping at straws and looking in the history for whatever catastrophe may sort of fit the bill for Atlantis sinking is because these people are not open to the new sciences, to real science, right? These people are not studying real new science. They are still latching on to the old school mainstream garbage that is perpetuated all over the place, right? And they've been, of course, they've been trained to believe that and only that. And if you bring any other evidence to them, which goes outside of that, they immediately discard it, right? That's a huge problem right now in mainstream alternative research. You know, for example, mainstream alternative researchers, especially the ones that are getting the spotlight on like Netflix or something, for example, like these people still believe in the Ice Age. Like they honestly believe that the Ice Age was real, and they never actually bring up the evidence and look at the evidence to see that, no, not only is the Ice Age not real, but there's a completely different scientific explanation of what actually happened during the period that these people call the Ice Age. Now that's a different topic for a different time, so we'll focus on the continent situation. But what researchers will do is they'll pick and choose whatever catastrophes fit their special theory, right? And so here on this channel, we don't have any pet theories. We're not going to do that. We are just going to follow evidence and see where it takes us. And in this case, in our thought experiment, that's what we're going to do. And that's what we're doing very slowly because I keep talking to myself about garbage. But the reality is we have a lot of stuff that we have to filter. Especially when, well, I guess, you know, not only when we look at the historical evidence, yeah, but the scientific evidence as well. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to worry about. So, okay, what do you mean by we have to filter stuff? So let's start with the historical side first. We can only use evidence that took place chronologically around the time that Atlantis would have sunk. So any other catastrophic event that took place after, of which there was at least one, and maybe two, well, two for sure, but one major one. And then any catastrophic event that took place prior to the sinking of Atlantis, you know, we also have to discard that stuff as well. So let's start with that. Actually, let's do that. Let's kind of clean up our historic timeline a little bit for us to kind of get an idea of what evidence we can use and what we should focus on chronologically. Now, like I said in the first part of the video before this dumb video, where the evidence is starting to point us towards chronologically of when these continents would have sank was around the 15th, 16th century BCE. Now, I realize that that sounds like a very, very close, very too close to us, too close to modernity to have ever happened. I get that, right? I mean, everybody is so used to the theory of uniformity running your mindset that everything has to take millions and billions of years. The concept of a whole continent sinking only 3,500 years ago sounds insane, and I completely understand that. But you know, the reality is, this is what our ancestors' stories tell us. These are the dates that we get when we start to seriously look and try to figure out when these events took place. These events did not take place 10,000 years ago, right? This did not happen during the quote-unquote deluge time. How do we know this? Well, I mean, it's simple. The deluge is told way before the other events of a sinking continent. Right, you know, one of the things that's interesting. Okay, so let's do this. Let's get rid of the deluge as the reason why the continent sank. I think this is important because too many alternative researchers attempt to grasp onto the deluge, even though it doesn't describe anything like what took place with the sinking continent, like really at all. Right, they still grab onto it because A, it's further enough back in time to where they don't have to present any evidence for it, and they can just say, oh yeah, well, you know, a lot of water came down, and of course a continent would have sank. I mean, it says that the lands were covered in water, so yeah, a continent sank. That's not the story of sinking continents at all, though, is it? Right, it's not. Let's use basic critical thinking and just get rid of the deluge right now so that we can move on with life and get closer to the truth. All right, the deluge takes time. And, you know, the reality is the deluge is once again in everybody's histories, right? Atheists hate this, but that's the reality. Remember, this is not a religious channel. I do not believe in God or anything like that, but you have to scientifically admit that the deluge is present in everybody's ancient histories. This is a scientific fact. There is no way around it. But this is also why alternative researchers can latch onto it and be like, yeah, there's probably some sort of truth there. And, you know, our ancestors were once again stupid monkeys, and they couldn't understand that just because a continent or something got flooded by a lot of rain one time, they thought a continent sank. Right? That didn't happen at all. That is not what is being described. That is not what our ancestors say. Right? The deluge is a provable, completely different, separate, catastrophic event that takes place long before Atlantis goes down or any of these other continents go down. And this is proven chronologically in how all of these ancient histories are told. Right? There are a lot of other horrific catastrophes that are recorded long after the deluge has taken place. The deluge, while one hell of a catastrophe, and as far as I can tell it happened, but that's a different show, the deluge cannot be blamed on sinking these continents because that's not what's described. Like, it's literally not what's described, right? The deluge takes time. Yes, it sucks. Yes, there's a lot of water that comes raining down from the sky, but it's important to remember that this water comes from the sky. And it also comes from the ground a little bit as well, which is also very interesting. And again, it's a completely different show. But anyways, the main point of the deluge is just a ton of water assaults Earth and covers Earth, right? That's kind of the basic general idea of it. All right, so if we have a continent that sinks, but other continents are still above water, is that really all water covering Earth? I mean, are we really going to say that? Are we going to say that that's what caused the sinking of a continent? An event that took place, you know, over several month period of time, depending on which deluge story you want to talk about, relative to everybody else's story about sinking continents, which happens overnight and is further along chronologically in their history. So the deluge cannot be used to explain a sinking continent. So this is an important scientific point, right? This is something we can use as critical thinkers that we can move on from. So we no longer have to pay attention to evidence where people say, hey, look, it was the deluge that sank Atlantis, and our ancestors were just too stupid, and they thought a lot of rain that flooded an area, they thought that it sank a continent, blah, blah, blah. And shut up. Yeah, that's not at all what is said. Nobody means it like that. That's alternative researchers grasping at straws because they don't want to look at real science, and they don't want to admit what our ancestors say in the histories. See, this is the problem. Alternative researchers that grasp at these kinds of straws and completely ignore all the other evidence just so that they can prove their little garbage, you know, pet theory, just fills me with unbelievable rage, right? Just absolutely fuels the, okay, all right. So anyway, and we're not going to, we can eliminate the deluge from being the cause of what our ancestors say sank a continent. And remember, it's important to remember that we are going to take our ancestors' stories literal. They say a continent sank beneath the waves and it's now gone forever, right? It did not come back out of the waves once all the water went away like the deluge would kind of say. No, the continent is gone. It's gone forever. Right? And nobody describes tons of rain on the scale that the deluge describes. This is another extremely important point to get rid of the deluge people. And we do have to get rid of it because it's not what is to blame. All right, so we can scientifically and historically prove that the deluge is not the event that sank the continents. All right, so this is an important point. We've now gotten rid of one of the thorns in our side when it comes to trying to explain what could have taken down a continent? It was not the deluge. All right, so let's move on. Okay, great, fine. So, some time passes after the deluge, fine, whatever. And then all of a sudden, our ancestors once again start talking about catastrophes. And they start talking about the gods in the sky doing stuff, fighting, playing out their games and all that crap up in the sky that is described and that is taken as a human drama by mainstream people. And alternative people don't really, I don't even know anymore. Like, alternative people, the way they look at these stories, they fit them in even weirdly than mainstream. At least mainstream, they just kind of personify them and just say, oh yeah, our ancestors were dumb. They wrote this weird fiction that didn't make any sense, and that was their story. And then they move on, right? The alternative side, it gets weird. People are like, well, maybe this person was real, but not, or mythologized in this way, but it gets weird on the mainstream alternative side. The reality is, the mainstream alternative side should be reading it more literal and employing real new science, and they would be closer to the truth. But that doesn't really happen. Anyway, so we now find ourselves after the deluge. Time passes. I have no idea how much time passes, by the way, from the deluge to the next major catastrophic event. Now, this next major catastrophic event that takes place, remember there are three, right? There are three main events. And these major events can be called the deluge, the Venus event, and then the Mars event, right? And they are spaced out over a period of time. The period between the deluge and the Venus event, like I said, I have no time period for this because dating methods suck. We don't really have a good grasp on real chronology anyways, so I can't give you a date. Like I said, I don't have a pet theory, so I'm not going to lie to you and say to you, I have some sort of time frame. I do not. But the way the history flows is we have the deluge, then a bunch of just, normal stuff kind of happens. There's some interesting events that take place, but there's nothing as destructive than what we will call the Venus event that happens next in the chronology. Now, the Venus event that happens in our chronology, this is the event that it certainly seems like would have been the catastrophe that took down these continents and, by extension, raised up other pieces of land from the ocean. Right? Now, all right, what am I talking about? What's going on here? Okay, so let's keep going with our critical thinking skills and try to... okay, let's do this. All right, we've gotten rid of the deluge. We now need an event that takes place that would explain this stuff. We need to find an event that encapsulates the amount of energy and power that it would take to sink a continent, and not only sink a continent, but remember, it's not just the continents go down. As we discussed earlier, there is a ton of fallout, not only from the continent sinking, but there's a lot of events going on which are attributed to the gods. And so we got to find a time, basically, to where the gods are doing some pretty crazy stuff. And by extension, we have planet Earth going through some pretty crazy, catastrophic stuff. And the next period in time that we find this is the Venus event. Now, the Venus event takes place, like I said, between the 14th century BCE and the 16th century BCE. So this time frame period area is where the evidence points us to where continents and land masses would have sank and rose. What the hell am I talking about? How do we prove that? So basically, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, okay, we need to... All right. So let's do this. Let's rewind a little bit. So the next question that we need to ask ourselves is, what period in history fits the bill to where a continent or continents could sink, but that all of our ancestors also report the kind of fallout that we would expect? So what we have to do now is we have to go and we have to look at everybody's history and try to find a general area to where the catastrophes line up across the board, right? So I mean, if we're going to have a mile high, mound of water going around, a couple mile high, mountain of water going around the planet, there should be more than like one culture that sees that. We should also have to deal with all kinds of other geological events. Earthquakes should be insane. So we have to find a time to where the earthquakes are just out of this world. We have to find a time where tsunamis are running rampant. And basically, we have to find a time to where everybody is dealing with quite a lot of severe catastrophes simultaneously, because that is exactly what kind of an event would take place, or that is what we would expect from the event of a continent sinking. We should expect, just a plethora of garbage assaulting this planet. So we need to find that period of time. Now, can we do that? And the answer is yes, we can do that, and we can do it in spades. Now, like I said, one of the things we have to deal with in history and catastrophism, so we have to separate everybody's stuff. We have to make sure that we are not taking the wrong catastrophe and attaching it to a story that it's not correlated with in reality. So we have to be able to look at this stuff and filter out the other catastrophes. And that's what we've already started to do. So I'm basically repeating myself because I'm dumb and can't stop doing that. All right, so let's try to find a period in all of our ancestors' history that meets the requirements of tons of different kinds of catastrophes happening simultaneously around a time to where we are also having reports of land masses sinking beneath the waves. Something else that we are going to want to look for is any period where we find huge empires, or basically any kind of civilization as we may have known it in the past, come to an end. Like if there's any kind of echoes of large empires immediately ending overnight, or anything like this. That is what we want to try to find. Because the reality is, if we have these kind of events taking place, it's not just the land masses and a few tribes that are going to suffer, right? It's going to be entire empires. Do we find a time in history where we have a bunch of empires collapse and disappear into the darkness of history? And here comes one of our major problems when we start to study catastrophism. Ancient history is littered with countless kinds of catastrophes. And a lot of these catastrophes, while they may have taken place in a different period of time, they still kind of sound the same. So for example, the biggest offender, and I've already kind of talked about it, but it's worth talking about in a little more depth, is the flood, the deluge problem, right? So people, the sunken continent problem we have right here. People want to blame the deluge on the sinking of a continent because it kind of works. And that's all it does, though. It only kind of works. It doesn't fill the actual bill. It's not what you're truly looking for. But the terminology is important. So one of the things that we would be looking for if a continent went down is a flood. But that does not mean that the flood that we find, or one of the many floods that we find throughout ancient history, is going to be the flood problem that would have arisen during the time our continent went down. That's a serious issue. Like, we have to be able to sort the catastrophes. Now, how the hell do we do that? Now, this is a legitimate problem that we face. And actually, I'm going to talk about it, because as we start to pick this entire subject apart, we're going to have to filter the information. We really do need a legitimate way of saying, hey, look, this catastrophe happened this time, this other one happened during this time, a separate time, and once you separate those things, then we can start to build a basic chronology. But how do we do that? Now, this is a legit question that might sound simple and easily ignored or easily solved, but the problem with catastrophism is that the very nature of catastrophism, or catastrophes, is going to jumble up all of the evidence. And this is one of our problems. So, if we're going to prove that you can sink a continent, I guess we're just doing this hypothetically. I get it. But screw it. We're doing Atlantis. We're going to try to prove that it's possible that Atlantis itself could have sunk. I know you're probably thinking, well, what about, shouldn't we prove it exists first? Shut up. No, we're just going to prove that it sunk. Okay, that's all we're doing right here. So, to do that, though, we are going to have to find the correlated events that would happen during the sinking of a continent. But we have a serious issue. Now, we have to start somewhere, so let's look at the geological evidence. That makes sense. I mean, right? We're talking about a sinking continent. That's kind of geologically based, right? So let's do the geologic evidence. Is that even a word? Geologically evident? Geology evidence? I don't know. Whatever. Who cares? We have to deal with the geologic evidence. That's a word, right? Geologic? All right, so the geology, we have to look, geology should probably give us some answers, right? And we can look at the geology. But here's the thing, when we start to look at the geology and we're looking for some sort of a destructive situation that would have happened, you know, in the Atlantic area, right? You could look, we would be looking around the North American area, into the European area. Probably also, if we're going to be using Atlantis as our example, we are also going to want to look in the Mediterranean area for this kind of evidence. Africa, we're going to want to look at the African shores, and South America. Wow, it's like every single continent that exists should probably have some form of evidence to support the fact that a landmass in the middle of the ocean went down. All right. Now, what's interesting is when we start to explore the geology of all of the shorelines of these continents, is that we do indeed find tons, I mean an ungodly amount of evidence that supports some extraordinary catastrophes that went down, right? Or that at least affected said continents. This situation highlights our problem. When we start to look at the geological evidence of these continents on these shores, under the water, all of this stuff, we find all kinds of crazy stuff going on. We find all kinds of weird anomalies. We find all kinds of evidence well, I mean, the reality is we find all kinds of evidence for a plethora of different catastrophes. And this is our problem, right? So we know for a fact, if we are just going to listen to our ancestors, that the earth was hit by all kinds of stuff, right? And by that all kinds of stuff, I don't mean all kinds of stuff in one particular period of time. The earth has been just smacked around by multiple kinds of catastrophes. So what that means, though, is that, you know, let's say, for example, the flood happened. And by the flood, I mean the deluge, you know, that whole Noah thing, or the Utnapishtim thing, or, you know, whatever particular thing you're into, whichever one. There's tons of flood stories. But that's our problem, right? There's all kinds of flood stories. So if the deluge was real, you know, Earth being inundated with rain and like high waters there for a period of time, that would leave geological evidence, right? I mean, it would leave something, and it would depend on the severity of the rain and how stuff went, and the environment of the time, which was different than it is today. You know, that is how the geological evidence would be created. Now, this is where we run into a serious problem, because not only do we have multiple flood stories, but we also have multiple flood stories taking place at different times chronologically. A lot of alternative researchers do not understand this. It's very important when you are reading all of our ancient ancestors' histories. They don't just talk about one flood and then that's it, right? They don't do that. They talk about, hey, there was this one really bad flood that happened with this particular amount of circumstances. And then later on, there is another type of flood that happens with another set of circumstances, right? They don't just talk about one flood, but the problem is the mainstream alternative research group, or people, or whatever the hell we want to call them, they will immediately just coalesce all of these flood stories into one story because they don't trust our ancestors and what they're reporting, which is obviously a huge mistake. But because they don't trust the history, and that's fine, I get it, you know, you can't trust everything, and you shouldn't, but they don't make the distinction between multiple flood stories. And this distinction is incredibly important to understand what's going on in our past. So we run into the issue with alternative researchers lumping everything together, great. And once they lump all these flood stories together, suddenly they have what seems like one hell of a catastrophe that could sink an island, right? If you're lumping in the deluge with all of these other flood stories, the destruction is absolutely insane, right? You have destruction coming from every possible angle you could imagine, and this would give you an excuse to explain why or how an island or a continent or continents or islands could have sunk. And it's beautiful, right? It's hard to come against that, because if you say, hey, look, I am looking at the geological evidence, and the geological evidence does indeed show that there has been mass water flows on this planet, right? That's not argued. Nobody contests that, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But, if you're going to throw all of these flood stories together, then you have a tremendous amount of ammo to support your personal theory on how Atlantis could have sunk, right? And that's what we find. But here is where, if we stay objective, here is where we find our problem. So we have to admit that, yes, there's a flood story in our ancient history. Everybody has it. Now, the next thing we have to look at, and we have to admit, is there are more than one flood story in all of our ancient histories. And there is a chronology attached to it. Whether you like it or not, there is a flow. So the deluge of what everybody knows from like the Noah times or Utnapishtim or, although that particular kind of flood takes place way, way, way back in time. The next kind of flood we find in history, which is devastating, but is described completely differently, would have been the times where we have, say, and I hate to use this, but everybody's going to know this, the Exodus kind of a situation, right? We have seas parting and mountains of water going over entire continents, etc. And you do indeed have floods all over the planet, but it is objectively a different kind of flood, right? Now it is, and not only, now I realize that it's kind of described flood-wise, and it is water flooded planet and areas during the Exodus kind of a period, but it's a completely different kind of flood. And this is where alternative researchers don't want to admit this kind of stuff. And the reason why alternative researchers do not want to admit and or look at this stuff and take it seriously is because even for them, it's crazy. I mean, stuff gets insane. It's bad enough, really. I mean, really, if you think about it, it's crazy enough that we already have the deluge kind of a flood, right? You have 40 days, 40 nights, or whatever particular period that ancient culture is talking about of just constant rain. And that's very important. There is a huge difference between just a constant rain flooding the planet as opposed to, meteors and the earth shaking and mountains of water being dragged across the planet. Two completely different, separate kinds of floods. Now, we have to admit this, all right? And this is a fact. It's a fact. It's in the history. This then brings us to the next problem geologically. If we do indeed have multiple catastrophes throughout the ages, and they are on this scale, they are on this planet-shredding scale, that means that, so for example, when the deluge happened, great, it would have left evidence, but, a few thousand years later, or whenever it happened, I don't have a time frame for that. I haven't seen anybody have one either. Once the next kind of earth-shaking catastrophe happens, that means that whatever flood evidence would have existed to support the deluge is going to be absolutely altered, destroyed, or wiped off the face of the planet by the next catastrophe. Now, this is the reason why alternative researchers can make the claim and can get away with it that essentially all of these flood stories, even though they're separated chronologically, they can try to make the excuse that it all happened simultaneously. Because it's all crazy, right? And we don't really have the 100% proof anyways, so they can commit the exact same crime that the mainstream commits, basically, right? I mean, they can just write stuff off just because it sounds good. And there's no, well, there's basically, for your average person cannot prove these people wrong. And because the average person can't prove these people wrong, and that's on the alternative side and the mainstream side, because you really can't do anything against that, at least initially, they can get away with it. I mean, they get away with it. They get Netflix specials, they get billions of views on YouTube, and then people believe it because it sounds so believable and because it fits well enough within whatever headcanon they currently have going on at the time. But the reality is, that's not how it goes. Our ancestors don't say how it goes like that, and the geological evidence also does not support it. What the geological evidence does support is that it does indeed support the concept of multiple earth-shredding catastrophes. That is exactly what we see. Now, if you are a standardly trained person in the mainstream, or, like I was just complaining about, a standard trained person in the alternative research community, you are not going to be able to identify or want to identify the fact that the geological evidence truly does support a range of cataclysms that have taken place on this planet over a period of time. And that period of time, by the way, is not millions or billions of years. It's only separated by a few thousand years, realistically. Some are really only separated maybe by 1,000 years, depending on where we're talking about. But the sinking of a continent kind of geological evidence, when we start trying to figure out how you can do that and you look at the geological evidence, one of the first things that we're struck by, well, okay, yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so yeah, I know, 10 years to get to the point. So when we start to look at the geological evidence, one of the first things that has to stick out to you, I don't care who you are, mainstream, alt-side, whatever, one of the things that has to stick out to you is that the evidence is crazy. And it certainly does not line up, for sure, with mainstream geological outlooks. It just doesn't. There's nothing to argue about. There's nothing that, come at me, feel free. But the reality is, at the end of the day, geologists don't have explanations for quite a lot of stuff. So for example, let's do this. So up in North America, up in the North American area, the northwest part of North America, what we find up there is a gigantic field of lava. This field of lava is known as the Columbia Plateau. Now, geologists will talk about it here and there, but what they will not talk about is the uncomfortable facts that have arisen while studying this kind of geology. Now, here's a couple of pieces, and if you're wondering what the hell does this have to do with sinking of a continent, a lava flow. I mean, lava flowing, that kind of would matter to sinking of a continent. It would matter. Anyway, the Columbia Plateau is extremely fascinating, and it's one of just tons of examples all over this planet that prove catastrophism, by the way, and recent catastrophism. But anyway, the geology of the Columbia Plateau is amazing because what we find there is we find a huge portion of the North American continent over there on the west side. And it's a big chunk. I don't know how many acres it is. Just go look up Columbia Plateau, but it's huge. What we find is a huge plateau of lava that is almost a mile deep in certain areas. A mile deep lava flow that covers hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres of land. Right now, this exists and no geologist argues it. The problem with the Columbia Plateau is this: there are no volcanoes in the area at any particular point in time, nowhere that exists right now at all in any capacity that could have ever produced the kind of lava flow that we see on that plateau. Even worse for geologists is that when they started looking at this lava flow and they were starting to, get into it and figure out what was going on, what they found was that the lava flow is not old. It is not billions of years old. It is not millions of years old. It is, if they are honest, if they are intellectually honest and look at the data for real, it's only thousands of years old. We have a mile-deep lava flow in North America that covers a chunk of the continent that is only a few thousand years old. That is insane. That is insane. Even if this took place 1,000,000 years ago, that huge of a lava flow it's just mind-blowing. I mean, how the hell do you even do that? Especially when you have no volcanoes in the area to create such a lava flow. Even worse for geologists is that when they started drilling core samples into this plateau, they accidentally ran into and recovered artifacts, human artifacts, underneath the mile of lava, still intact, that dates back only a few thousand years. So, what we find is that we find one hell of a catastrophic incident that would have happened on a place that people live on, the Columbia Plateau, and nobody even thinks about it. A mile-deep lava flow that literally flowed over ancient man just a few thousand years ago. And there's no volcanoes to support this kind of lava. Even more funny, because at this point it's hilarious, just watching, you should watch YouTube videos of these geologists just trying to cope with the fact that this evidence exists, and they keep trying to like put the lava flow back like millions of years or whatever. They're like, oh yeah, you know, this study proves that, but then they ignore all the other studies, right? They only tell you what works for them. It's just like dating, right? Like you know, geologists or archaeologists, they'll send stuff off to carbon daters and they'll get like 5 or 6 dates back or whatever, and they will only use the dates that come close to whatever their theory is, and they discard the dates that are like, you know, tens of thousands, if not millions of years off from the, you know, anyway, it's hilarious. Okay, so anyway, what this shows, though, if we look at the evidence objectively, is that we can have continent-altering, absolutely insane destruction going on only a few thousand years ago, right? And we have the evidence for it. It is there. Now, I bring this up because it's an important bullet point of information that shows how insane true geology really is relative to human existence, and how much mainstream people fear the evidence of what this shows. All right. So what we have on this planet, though, geologically, is we have evidence for all kinds of crazy geological events happening, and none of them work with the standard plate tectonic theory. They just don't work. Like that lava field we just discussed really quick, that does not fit into plate tectonics whatsoever. It's funny to watch geologists try to make it fit into whatever garbage theory they have going on, but it doesn't work. Like if you're objective, it doesn't work. Realistically, all the geologists, when they start to look at a lot of the strata and a lot of the evidence, they really should just admit that they do not know why we are seeing what we are seeing, and then move on and just keep studying and keep trying to gather data. We do not find that when we deal with mainstream geology, do we? So mainstream geology gets weird when if we're going to use any kind of mainstream geological, we can use the evidence, but we can't really use their outcomes. You know, we can't use whatever they surmise from the evidence, because their conclusions are generally completely misguided, because they have a very, very specific narrative that they have to uphold. And we all know that, right? So they have to do that. But that doesn't mean the evidence is bad, right? The raw data evidence, right? Pictures of rocks, where they were found, how they were found, etc. That stuff is important. So don't just discard mainstream evidence. Discard their outcome. Like, don't worry about their conclusion, because the conclusions are garbage. And it's funny, if you don't believe me on that, go pick a random conclusion that geologists made about rock that's supposed to have existed, I don't know, pick like 1 billion years ago, just for fun. Run it through the scientific method, stay objective, and then see if see if their conclusion remains solid after you've put it through the ringer. Right, it doesn't. Like, pretty much everything that these people talk about immediately falls apart once you apply critical thinking and the scientific method. It's hilarious. I highly recommend doing it for everything, and you should be doing it for everything anyways. All right, so what else do we have? Okay, so the geological record. So here's the problem. If we have a mile-thick lava flow covering a human settlement only a few thousand years ago, you know, what does that do to any of the geological evidence that may have come before that lava flow that would have proven a different kind of a catastrophe? Here's our problem, and everybody faces this problem, both on the alternative research side and the mainstream research side. The evidence is being destroyed by other cataclysms. All right, that is something that we have to understand when we start looking at this stuff. So for anybody who wants to blame, Atlantis sinking on the deluge, for example, you have to be careful with your evidence, your physical evidence. Obviously these people are not being careful with the historical stories, right? They're not listening to those, but they're also not truly looking at the geology in a scientific sense, and they're not being honest with themselves when they start to interpret the geology and start to realize that, oh, hey, by the way, we have multiple cataclysms that happened here that literally shifted the ground. So directions that you see the strata pointing does not mean that that is what they were pointing with before another catastrophe. For example, okay, so I kind of got ahead of myself for example, but that's my point, right? So if you have a rock that was, or you have land or whatever that was messed up due to the deluge, for example, right? Okay, great. If you could go back in time right after the deluge and you could look at stuff, you could be like, oh yeah, that's evidence for a ton of water raining down on the earth and flowing, and you can see the striation on the rocks and all that stuff and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, cool. You could point that back then and be like, all right, look, I see the evidence that was created. But if that same evidence is now being covered in a mile thick flow of lava, does that evidence, first of all, does it still exist? Was it literally melted away, right? We have to remember this, that we have irrevocably lost evidence to other cataclysms that may support your pet theory. So be careful with that stuff. This is not what alternative researchers want to hear, by the way. Right? Alternative researchers are just as bad as the mainstream because they've got their idea that they're trying to sell, and they love it and they're focused on it, and nobody wants to admit that you have a lot of problems with your pet theory. That's why there's no reason to have a pet theory. All right, it's just obnoxious. There's no, okay, all right. So we have to remember that when we start to look at the geological record, that other catastrophes have happened, regardless of the scale, and those catastrophes would have altered said evidence. So basically, we're fucked as far as evidence for catastrophism goes. And in fact, it's not just catastrophists that are screwed, it's anybody trying to search or research any kind of history or a lot of sciences too. Obviously, geology is beyond screwed. Like, if you're a geologist, I feel sorry for you, bro. You've got a lot of problems, and the funny part is the vast majority of geologists do not realize the kinds of problems that they truly have within their field. All right, so what do we do with this? What do you do? This is a serious problem that we have to deal with, and I bring it up, and I know it took like 10 hours to get to this point, but I bring it up because it is something really important to remember when we start to look at evidence and we start applying our little pet theories to things, right? Be careful with that. When you start to look at strata, don't forget that strata could have been uplifted, shifted down, blah, blah, whatever, overnight, right? It doesn't take millions of years to do this stuff. And there's all kinds of examples like this all throughout the geologic record. In fact, I'd probably argue that the entire geologic record that we are familiar with is probably all dictated essentially by catastrophes. You could probably make that case. I don't know how far down we've really drilled nowadays, but Earth is okay. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The main point is, the main point that we care about here, I don't care about how Earth was created. We're trying to sink a continent, so we don't need to go that far, because the postulate is that we're looking for a continent that would have sunk, only a few thousand years ago. Right, so we don't need to go down 20 billion feet into the earth to try to figure out the strata down there. It would be very close to the surface. But, once we start looking at all of this strata, everything is all jumbled up. So geology will obviously be a big help to help us answer this question, which we're not going to do in this video either, because we're almost at an hour and I'm tired of talking. Anyway, so it's really important to understand that if we're going to carry out this thought experiment, then we need to understand the problems with the evidence that we are going to run into, and these are objective problems, right? We cannot make the claim that a huge catastrophe has happened on this planet and then act like, oh yeah, the strata would be in perfect order, for example, right? We can't do that. So where does that leave us? That means that when we start to look at a lot of this evidence, we now have to factor in other cataclysms that happened after the one that would have sank a continent. So now we find ourselves in a position to where we can at least realistically still follow up on this question. I've given some examples of some pretty extreme and amazing, events that we have evidence for that are not that old. And the reason why I wanted to at least give a few examples was to set the stage to make us truly appreciate and understand the scale of these catastrophes, right? So whatever catastrophe took down a continent, we have to find something that's probably pretty major. This has got to be, there's probably no way that it was one of these smaller catastrophes that have happened, in between the bigger ones, obviously, right? But it would, I'm all stupid. Gee, you guys, I think it's a big catastrophe that would have sank a continent. I'm glad I wasted an hour of your time and mine to bring that point to a close. Or what? Anyway, all right. So I'm gonna call this. All right, but the next time we talk about this crap, we're going to have to try to figure out and find which of the catastrophes were the main catastrophes. And I think I started talking about it in the last video, but I don't remember anymore because I don't pay attention. But the next one that we'll do in this, I don't know, it's not a series. Anyway, the next thing we need to figure out and identify is indeed which catastrophe is the one that would have taken down continents. And we're going to have to find that criteria. We've established, at least up until this point, that it's entirely scientifically possible to find real evidence for some sort of major continent-altering event. Now, I believe that it was actually important for me to go through some of that, and I've only given a couple examples, right? But the point of those examples was to hit home to anybody who is on the fence about this kind of stuff. I'm showing literal evidence that the mainstream currently has at their disposal, and they're freaking out about it. Well, behind the scenes, they're freaking out about it. Most of them are not freaking out about it because most of them have bought into the garbage propaganda, and they all believe the millions and billions of years crap garbage timeline instead of actually looking at the evidence and then questioning the evidence and then wondering about it and then going from there and then realizing that their entire methodology is flawed anyway. Okay, so but the point is, real geologists, like the sharp ones, they understand this is a problem. They understand that, the lava thing, for example, if you have artifacts under a mile thick flow of lava, human artifacts that are only a few thousand years old, that's a problem. This is a problem, all right? You can't, they avoid it and they ignore it, but we can't do that, all right? So anyway, the point is that it is completely believable that some sort of a huge portion of a landmass could be heavily altered only a few thousand years ago. Now, let's keep going, actually, really quick. I know I was going to shut this up, but this is even more interesting. So, another part of the evidence, the exam, I know we're trying to sink a continent. I get it. But, in my opinion, it is extremely important to condition yourself psychologically to be open to some pretty crazy events, because our premise, what we're trying to figure out is insane, right? Sinking a continent is not trivial, right? But so if we're gonna say we can sink a continent, I can give you evidence for that, there has to be other things going on as well. So I know I just kind of started with the evidence that has nothing technically maybe to do with the sinking of it. Well, okay, it's funny. Like I said, let's keep going. The whole lava thing, that may have actually taken place during the exact same time that we lost the continents. Here we go. All right, we'll follow this chain of logic. So for example, if we have that, mile thick thing of lava, that whole field over there that covers a sizable chunk of the North American continent up there, if we have something like that, something had to have caused that as well, right? We know for a fact it was not volcanoes. Geologists try to be like, oh yeah, the volcanoes, they all magically eroded away. Not the lava or anything, but the volcanoes, they're all gone for sure. Like there's, the lava, nothing happened to the lava for some weird reason. But the volcanoes, they have mysteriously disappeared. That is literally the geologist's standpoint, right? Okay, so that's dumb. We don't have any evidence for volcanoes, so that means it could not have been a volcano that would have created that field. It had to be another event. So, does that mean that the event that created that lava field, is that correlated possibly with the same event that would have hit Earth that could have sank a continent? Like, that's a legitimate question. This is a scientific thing to look at. You know, and the answer is, yeah, maybe, actually. It gets even weirder, and I'll shut up in a sec, but it gets even weirder because we have eyewitness testimony from our ancestors about this stuff. Right now, geologists, they got nothing on that. There's nothing they can do about that. The stories are there. You know, the stories don't go back that far. They're not 12 billion years old. You know, they're only a few thousand. All right, that's it. All right, well, next episode, we'll start getting into more of the stuff. And perhaps, maybe, we will answer the question, how do you sink a continent? Because God knows we are not doing it in this episode. Now, I'm going to upload this right now to YouTube and see if they're dumb enough to actually put it on the website. I'll probably forget to upload it anyway.